Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the Pauline Letters. And today you can see we have come to the Bronx. We are at Yankee Stadium, and it's appropriate that we come here to talk about today's topic, the letter to the Galatians, the first of what we call the core four letters of the Pauline corpus. The core four, of course, the Yankees had their core four in the first part of this century. Just as the Yankees once had their core four, so the Pauline corpus has its core four letters of Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Romans. These four letters, which were once called by German scholars die Hauptbriefe, that sounds erudite, we're going to stick with the term core four. These four letters are Paul's longest letters and certainly his most influential letters, and we can think of them in two groups. Galatians and Romans both talk a lot about justification by faith, about the sufficiency of Christ for redemption, that Christ himself is enough. Of course, during the era of the Protestant Reformation, these letters were at the center of the controversy. Also in the other group, we have 1 and 2 Corinthians, which are more pastoral. They're troubleshooting letters. They describe the story of how Paul led a complicated church to union with Christ. They describe a lot of controversies, a lot of problems. We'll look forward to talking about those. For now, we're going to talk about Galatians. Today, as we look at Galatians, we're going to look at three main background questions. Often we talk about the epistolary elements, but in the case of Galatians, a few of them are difficult to determine. It's not altogether clear exactly who Paul's audience is. It's also not entirely clear what the occasion is, or at least what the precise occasion is, and Paul's message can seem confusing to a first-time reader. We'll address all three of those concerns in today's class. To begin with, to whom was Paul writing the letter to the Galatians? Scholars divide almost evenly between two theses. One is the South Galatia theory, in German the Provinzhypothese, the province hypothesis, which holds that Paul would have written Galatians to four cities in the southern part of the province of Galatia. During Paul's lifetime, the four cities of Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe formed part of the Roman province of Galatia. They're not really Galatian territory ethnically, though. We do know that Paul evangelized these cities during his first missionary journey. The Acts of the Apostles tells us so. So according to the South Galatia theory, Paul would have written Galatians to these churches after he had evangelized them on the first missionary journey. If that's true, the letter can likely be dated early. Indeed, some scholars would date it even before the Council of Jerusalem because they don't think that Galatians 2 refers to the same event that's referred to in Acts 15. That's a minority view, but it deserves to be mentioned. In contrast to the South Galatia theory, we have the North Galatia theory, in German, die Landschaftshypothese, the territory hypothesis. This view holds that Paul went to the ethnic territory of Galatia, that Paul went and evangelized the ethnic Galatians, the descendants of some Celtic immigrants who had come a few centuries before. This would have been further north near modern-day Ankara, the capital of the modern country of Turkey. The challenge with this hypothesis is that there's nothing in Acts of the Apostles that tells us explicitly that Paul went to that part of Galatia. All we know are two places in Acts where it says that Paul passed through Galatian territory, but it's not entirely clear what that means. While there's no precise way to know when we should date this theory, it would likely be a little bit later into the 50s, that Paul would have written this letter a little bit later on, perhaps from Ephesus, shortly before he writes 1 Corinthians. So why do scholars reach these different conclusions? Well, in favor of the South Galatia hypothesis, scholars generally point to history and geography. History because it would fit hand in glove with the first missionary journey according to Acts chapters 13 and 14, but geography also because the North Galatia hypothesis would have Paul going to these small, more mountainous towns in Central Asia Minor. That would have made a mission difficult there. Those who favor the North Galatia hypothesis, though, reply that that only matters if Paul were acting like a tourist rather than a missionary. They're arguing that Paul wasn't out to do the easy thing, and indeed we know that he wasn't from the Corinthian letters, among other places, also the captivity letters. The North Galatia hypothesis also has in its favor perhaps the most famous quotation from Galatians. "O stupid Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified?" Would that insult have made sense if Paul uttered it to people who were only part of the province and did not self-identify as Galatians. One scholar suggests that Paul calling southern inhabitants of Asia Minor Galatians would sound a little bit like someone traveling to Belfast, Northern Ireland, and calling everyone a bunch of Brits. While that might be true in a technical sense, people from Northern Ireland are of Irish ancestry. While they're loyal to the Queen and Northern Ireland is separate from the Republic of Ireland, it wouldn't quite fit. So a number of scholars, and I'm joined this side, believe the North Galatian hypothesis is more probable than the South Galatian hypothesis. One other interesting observation comes from Jerome Murphy O'Connor, the great Dominican biblicist, who points to this passage in Galatians chapter 4, where Paul lets us know that he evangelized these people because he was physically ill. You see, it says physical illness. It thus seems likely that Paul was going through different places and only stopped in a small place because he had to. According to Murphy O'Connor, it's very difficult to fit this detail into Acts' description of the first missionary journey. So perhaps a slight majority of scholars favors the North Galatia hypothesis, but in any case, it's a close call. So let's now move into our second question of why Paul wrote this letter. It's obvious from the text that it had something to do with circumcision, and Paul wanted to make the point clear that Gentile Christians did not need to first become Jews by being circumcised in order to become Christians. That much is clear. Where things start to break down is exactly what was the position being preached by these others that Paul calls the agitators, those who were agitating them, those who were disturbing the peace and the faith of the Galatian Christians. We don't have a written text that tells us from a sympathetic point of view what these other preachers were saying. So we have to resort to something scholars call mirror reading. This is a procedure that seeks to understand both sides of a debate when only the writings of one side are extant. We only know what Paul thought of these agitators. We don't have any text that tells us how the agitators understood themselves. Barclay, one scholar who wrote an article in which he described how to apply this procedure specifically to Galatians, describes the following points as being at least relatively certain. He describes as certain or virtually certain that there were Christian opponents who were demanding circumcision and called Paul's gospel into question with some success. These false preachers understood themselves to be Christians. Barclay also argues that it is highly probable that they were Jewish Christians, arguing especially based on texts in the book of Genesis, and he argues that it's probable that they had some connections with the Jerusalem church. We can look at this passage from Galatians chapter 4. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the freeborn woman. Indeed, throughout chapters 3 and 4, Paul repeatedly refers to Abraham. He refers to Genesis. These agitators would have looked to Genesis and said, see, Genesis 17 says you have to be circumcised. So you do. Paul's point is to say, no, you don't, because even before circumcision existed, Paul promised Abraham that he would become the father of many nations and that all the peoples of the earth would find blessing in him. That was in Genesis chapter 12. And moreover, Abraham's faith was reckoned to him as righteousness in Genesis 15. Both of those occurred before circumcision. And this brings us into how does this letter make sense? What's the message? Paul is clearly the sender. We've already addressed the question about the addressees, whether this is the North or the Southern Galatians. The occasion, it deals with these false preachers, even if we're not 100% sure what they're saying. But Paul, in his message, defends his presentation of the gospel. He has three goals. To defend the authenticity of his gospel, he's going to use forensic rhetoric for that. He's going to acquit himself. He's going to explain how it frees them from the Mosaic laws, prescripts, and curses. He's going to use some demonstrative rhetoric to say, here's who we are and here's what our values are. We're not like these other people. And third, he's going to implore his converts to live in the true freedom of the Spirit. That's deliberative rhetoric. In our next class, we're going to look more in depth at these demonstrations. Until then, read well and pray well.